Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to Chennai International Center first and to this event. We just recently started having these physical events. This is one of the first few that we are having here. Nice to see people face to face and interact. Welcome. Special welcome to Dr. Rangarajan who is here. Mr. Sesashai, N. Ram, Jawahar Vadivelu, lot of the public intellectuals of Chennai are here. Very welcome. I knew Dr. S. Narayan will not miss this. Welcome, Narayan. So today it's going to be it's not a panel discussion or anything like that. It's going to be a talk or a lecture by Raguramrajan. I'm not going to say anything about him. All of you can claim some familiarity with him from this part of the country. So there is going to be a session that's going to be moderated. So we will come to that part as soon as he finishes that lecture. That's it's a person, an anchor from CNBC is going to moderate the session. So just quickly, there are a couple of points that I wanted to make. I'm no economist, I don't understand this. But I read an article by a friend of mine, one Dr. Narayan Ramachandran. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's a microeconomist, earlier head of Morgan Stanley here in India, is the chairman of RBL Bank. So he'd recently written an article in the Mint that's titled On a Knife's Edge Between Reflation and Stagflation. That's the topic. And the byline there is, massive stimulus packages could lead to high inflation amid low growth if global production capacity lags overall demand. A very, very powerful statement. So many of you may be able to make some sense out of it. The points that you're making, I'll just very quickly in the next 2 minutes read out. You're saying the pandemic is a unique economic event from the point of view of today's globalized world. The world has been through an unconventional decade of monetary stimulus to prevent economies from the threat of deflation. Despite this, there was only 1 year of synchronized global growth in the year 2017 during the entire decade before the pandemic struck. That's very extraordinary. To this extraordinary monetary stimulus, we have added a significant fiscal stimulus in the aftermath of the pandemic. At the same time, populist politics around the world has necessitated that economic policy be more focused towards broader social goals, including universal healthcare, inequality, and climate change. As one of the fastest growing economies, India will continue to attract capital in a low interest rate world, thus stabilizing its currency, current account, and macroeconomy. The capital can help build on the vibrant startup sector that Indian entrepreneurs have shown a great propensity for. At the same time, without significant reform in factor markets and material improvement in supply chains and logistics, increasing demand will only add to inflationary pressures. A typical economist type of a statement, on the one hand, on the other hand type. So it concludes by saying India must accelerate reforms and prioritize investment over consumption while remaining ever vigilant on inflation. And the last point that I want to make, which was very interesting, was when Elon Musk was asked the question in one of the recent interviews about the stimulus, the trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure spend that the US government is planning to launch. So when he was asked that question, he said, I would just scan it. It's not going to be of any use, just scan it, is the answer that he said. And then went on to talk about his favorite subjects like spaceship, Neuralinks, and things like that. So that's the context, that's the world that we are living in, deep technology and entrepreneurs on one side, and the other challenges that we face. So in that context, let me welcome Dr. Raguramrajan on behalf of Chennai International Center and the participants here. And over to you, Dr.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today, Dr. Rangarajan, Mr. M.K. Narayan, and distinguished guests. I want to talk about something different from the current conjuncture. What's going on in the world, inflation, what's happening in China, etc. I want to talk about India, and I want to talk about India's economic future. And I want to argue that that future is eminently correlated or linked to how our democracy evolves. And that's going to be the subject of my talk. That is why it's entitled Constitutionalism and India's Economic Future. Now, I'm not a lawyer or a political scientist. In fact, some of my critics would say I'm not an economist either. But I'm an Indian citizen who believes fundamentally in our future. As you know, India is rebounding today, and with strong growth numbers, there's a sense of optimism. Any growth should be celebrated, as well as the optimism. But we can't ignore the fact that the rebound is from disastrous numbers posted last year and in the first quarter of this financial year. More generally, we have been underperforming our potential for over a decade, probably since the onset of the global financial crisis. And the key measure of this underperformance is our inability to create the jobs our youth need, our inability to fulfill our economic, or I should say our demographic dividend. Some say the problem is with democracy, with the checks and balances imposed by our Constitution. And I differ fundamentally with this view. In my view, it's our democracy, fortified by our Constitution, that has brought us this far, keeping India integrated and rectifying the mistakes that we occasionally make. But democracy also requires constant course correction in response to the changing environment and a constant revitalizing of its institutions. In my view, this is the important task we now have, and it is vital to our continuing economic growth. Unless we recognize the connections between democracy, governance, and growth, and act upon them, we're going to offer partial, inadequate solutions to the problems that we face. Now, no doubt as a country, we've had enormous success. Before the recent slowdown, we had a quarter of a century of 7% average growth, something very, very few large countries have achieved. I think you can count them on the fingers of a single hand. Wherever I go, I also tout India's successes recently, such as the Aadhaar stack and its applications, such as the Universal Payment Interface, or UPI. This is a state-of-the-art system where we have now over 4 billion transactions a month on UPI. It offers an important lesson, though, on what succeeds in India. What works for us are thoughtful frameworks or infrastructure that free our people to utilize their creativity and enterprise. A similar example, in this case, hard physical infrastructure, is the Golden Quadrilateral Highway Building Program that is, in a sense, opened up and connected India. Similarly, today we have the rural roads projects of successive governments, including the present one, which, by connecting a village to the rest of India, does wonders for the village economy. Overnight, for example, dairy and poultry farming takes off because milk, eggs, and chicken can be transported to markets. Shops start stocking the latest goods, and you start seeing economic activity flourish inside the village. I could go on, but the point is, there are many examples of our success. Many of them have to do with creating the right framework to harness the energies of our people. But we also see increasing signs of malaise, perhaps because the liberalizing reforms of the 1990s, which Dr. Raguramrajan played such an important part, as well as the early 2000s during the first NDA regime, perhaps those reforms have run their course, and we now need fresh ideas. Examples of this malaise, on the economic side, instead of pushing for more open markets, our business community is once again supporting more protectionism. Domestically, more and more social groups are calling for job and college reservations for their communities, for subsidies and supports for their profession. States are reserving jobs for locals, undermining the idea of one India. The pandemic's toll has further diminished our self-belief or our Atmavishwas, even while pushing some of the middle class into poverty. The World Bank says 75 million. I think that figure is high, but it still is a number that we should be concerned about. Yes, we have a soaring stock market, and we have 60 plus Indian unicorns, and those should be a source of some pride. But it shouldn't make us lose sight of the fact that so many have been scarred by the pandemic. And this is reflected in tepid consumption growth for middle class goods. Under par economic performance, especially our inability to create good jobs and take advantage of our growing young labor force, is also affecting our democracy. Our willingness to debate, to respect and tolerate differences is taking a hit, not just at the center, but in many states. Community sentiment is quickly hurt, and this is used to bludgeon those who behave or think differently. The room for political adventurers to exploit division and a sense of grievance to political advantage has increased, and they are taking advantage of it. Now, democracy has always worked in India, as elsewhere, to tell the government where it's going off track. Criticism forces course corrections. When the space for criticism shrinks, the government only hears applause and has little ability to recognize its mistakes. Democracy in a diverse country like India also serves as a safety valve, allowing the representatives of the aggrieved to make their case in the halls of parliament without the aggrieved taking to the streets. As democracy contracts, the street becomes the arena to negotiate disputes, which serves no one. The danger then is our subpar economic performance undermines both our economy and our democracy in a vicious downward spiraling circle. The root cause of our subpar economic performance, however, I would argue, is not too much democracy. Instead, it is that our democracy has not responded enough to our economic needs, and our economic vision has not respected our democratic ethos. Too many of our people do not have the capabilities that many of us in this room have. Too many of our people do not have the opportunities that go to relatively few in the economy. We have to remove the impediments that hold back so much of our population, including our largest minority, our women. So how do we remedy this? What is the economic vision that should carry us forward? Clearly, the central thrust of any economic program has to be to create good, well-paying jobs for all. But where will those jobs come from? One possibility is manufacturing-led growth, the East Asian way. Yet we must ask, what is India's source of competitive advantage here? We certainly have a reasonably sized market where Indian firms can learn by doing and improve their productivity. And certainly the government is giving firms some protection by raising tariffs so that they can have a safe, protected space in which to learn. But ultimately the challenge will be to compete for the global market, since in many areas our domestic market is not big enough for sustained corporate growth. Take, for example, the world market for steel or autos. Despite the Indian market being big, the world market is 20 to 25 times the size of the Indian market. So we have to really compete for the global market if we want to grow over a long period. And there is a time-tested path for export-led growth shown by the East Asian economies. Essentially, these countries, in their authoritarian phase, compensated for poor infrastructure and finance by repressing worker wages, worker rights, and household interest payments. They maintained an undervalued exchange rate, thus hurting domestic consumers at the expense of producers. However, this combination, combined with protection, allowed them to compete for a global market, even though their firms were not very productive, because you got cheap capital, you got cheap labor, and the household, the consumer, paid the price. Now, firms used the time they were protected to learn by doing and to make themselves globally competitive, and the government during this process helped by improving infrastructure like power and roads and logistics, and improved the education, skilling, and health of the workforce. From that, we got the East Asian tigers, and to some extent, this also represents the story of China. The question we have to ask is some of this possible or even desirable in our democracy? It's very hard to repress the labor force. It's very hard to favor producers at the expense of consumers to try and manipulate the exchange rate. It is very hard in this country to build highways by seizing land. You immediately get protests. And none of this is really desirable. We do have a China fetish. Certainly, they are the only other country our size, and we want to do what they did. And obviously, their pace of growth has been admirable, and we would like to emulate it. But we don't, and some would say thankfully, have the system they have. If so, can we really aspire to follow their path? And even if that way was still feasible, the world has become resistant to the Chinese way of growth. Politically, it's very hard to export your way, especially if you're a big country like India, export your way to growth. We have to largely find a different way using the strengths of our system. And also remember, the export-led growth path had a central problem. You wanted to create domestic protection through tariffs, but tariffs ultimately are self-defeating. A tariff on inputs makes it harder for firms to compete globally. For example, a car maker paying high domestic prices for steel will be globally uncompetitive because they're paying too high prices for inputs. Similarly, tariffs on final goods gives producers very little incentive to be competitive. As we saw, our car industry slip further and further behind global standards when it was protected. The Ambassador car of 1990 was little changed from the Morris Oxford of 1956. So tariffs have to be lifted gradually across the board, and ultimately they have to go away. But it has to be done at the right time. And we've tried in the past and not succeeded. Our firms never thought they were ready to compete in the 70s and the 1980s when other emerging markets embarked on their export-led growth. And without any pressure to be competitive, we did not improve the quality of our infrastructure or of our workers. It took a crisis in 1990-91 for us to liberalize. And since then, we had our best 2 decades of growth. Among the successes of our liberalization is our two-wheeler industry, some of whose leaders are represented in this room. We are the world's largest exporters of two-wheelers. Another is our generic pharmaceutical industry, which has and will be instrumental in the fight against COVID. Yet today, why are we pessimistic? We are pessimistic because clay Ganeshas are imported from China and not made in India. And again, we see protectionists gaining influence again. And their gospel of our inability to compete is dominating thought in Delhi. If Atmanirbhar means old-style protectionism, it is a time-tested failure. I sincerely hope it is not. What we do need, however, is Atmavishwas, drawn from our past successes. We need to understand why we are successful in two-wheelers and pharmaceuticals and a total failure in making clay Ganeshas. The reality is we have a competitive presence in higher skilled manufacturing where high-quality infrastructure, low wages, and cheap capital are not as critical. If we do want to make cheap, mass-produced clay Ganeshas, we will have to levy tariffs on Chinese Ganeshas. But perhaps we shouldn't be making those Ganeshas. Instead, perhaps we can leapfrog over the old export-led manufacturing growth using cheap labor route, which I will call the China path, directly to the post-industrial society, which I will call the India path. For instance, we can leapfrog into high-skilled services. Software was our initial foray, and today the software industry is booming. I think our gentleman from Cognizant will tell us that it's impossible to find workers because that industry is exporting to the world and is finding business everywhere. But with the pandemic showing us how to work at a distance, far more has become feasible than just software. In many high-skilled services, only a recognized degree and trust stops our people from serving the world. Why can't we do management consulting, not just for India, but for the world? As you know, many Indians populate management consulting firms across the world. Why can't they do it from firms headquartered in India? Why can't we do legal services, telemedicine, edutech, financial services, all from India? Now, many of these are certainly necessary to serve the large Indian market, but there's no reason why we should be pessimistic about our ability to export it to the rest of the world. Quality education is also a sector of the future, and it is necessary for this kind of India path if we are to provide that recognized degree which allows our labor to leapfrog from being confined to producing for India to producing for the world. It is also quality education a service which we can make a viable industry. Our colleges and universities need not just cater to Indian students, they can cater to students from across the world, the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and even the West. We should encourage private and foreign efforts to set up quality universities rather than, I've been involved with 2 of them, finding impediments all along the way. Indian art and culture could be yet another high value added export. We find yoga now making its way across the world, but what about the rest of Indian culture? Cannot that be a soft export? Our movies, our plays, our literature, those are high value added items and could bring a lot in terms of production and earning to the country. Now, that doesn't mean we abandon agriculture or manufacturing, but we recognize that our competitive advantage is not in the commodity versions of those, but in value added, even while we try and remedy some of the weaknesses like the quality and extent of our labor, the quality and extent of our infrastructure. I'm not saying be defeatist and abandon manufacturing. I'm saying focus on what is our competitive advantage right now rather than going along a path which is very, very difficult given our different system. For instance, in agriculture, what about adding value using the immense sort of potential for production in our rural areas? If the United States can make branded rice noodles, why can't India? Why can't we make pasta? If the United States can make pasta, it doesn't just have to be Italy. What about selling Haldiram's bhujia in Safeway in California rather than just in the Indian stores in the West? Why can't we market Vadam and Vattal not just to South Indian NRIs, but to the world? The point is, there is a lot more we can do using our knowledge, our creativity, our skills. India can move up the value chain. Rather than being the back office to the world, we can become the front office to the world. But it requires our corporations to build trust in the quality of their services and also a bunch of other things in this modern world. For instance, data protection, which I'll come to. We can also bring the world to India. We can offer labor-intensive services cheaply, but with a fair amount of value added. Ordinary tourism certainly is something which is underexploited, but also health tourism, old age retirement homes. These are lots of possibilities that we can certainly explore. There is no dearth. I could go on for some time. There's no dearth of possibilities outside of manufacturing-led exports. The broader point is to recognize India need not follow the Chinese path. It can create its own path. And indeed, the Chinese path may not be available to us since we don't have the single-mindedness of their government, their lack of democracy when they're growing fast, and because we're really late to the game in export-led growth. Now, the Indian path requires that we use the diverse ideas emanating from our democracy rather than trying to impose a bland uniformity. It requires harnessing the energy of our people rather than suppressing it. And it involves embracing the world rather than protecting ourselves from it. And this is a much more imaginative and attractive path. Wouldn't an innovative workforce engaged in skilled and creative work be a future that we want to aspire to relative to a dull and repressed workforce engaged in low-skilled assembly. The skill-based growth is so much more attractive. And what gives us a comparative advantage in the skill-based growth, especially in the world of today, is indeed our democracy, which is strong and vibrant and can be made stronger and vibrant, even more strong and vibrant. So we should see democracy not as a weakness, as something to suppress, but we should see it as our comparative advantage in embarking on the Indian path. What does all this mean in practical terms for policy? I would pick four ways we need to make changes. First, we need to invest more in our people. Second, we need to decentralize policy making to the extent possible and measure and publicize local outcomes. And there are reasons why I will say this in just a minute. We need to strengthen and protect individual rights. And we need to create an enabling framework for the industries of the future. These are 4 points I'll elaborate on in just a second. Let's start with investing in people. You know, all the growth paths I've talked about, whether manufacturing-led growth or skill-based growth, require improving the capabilities of our people, especially given the ravages of the pandemic. I've talked in different fora of the damage the pandemic has done to our school children. Keeping them out of school for a couple of years sets them back, especially the poorer ones, 3 or 4 years. And then the temptation is not to put them back in school, to take them out, to get the girl children married off, to get the boy children working in the fields. That's not what we want. We don't want to lose a generation. We need to do a lot to repair the damage. But we need to go further, especially if we are going to go on skill-based growth. We need a more skilled economy, a more skilled workforce than was available for manufacturing-led growth. Now, how do we achieve this? Well, we need to improve the quality of public goods that we provide, such as childcare, health services, education services, as well as the basic safety net. Now, so far, especially when it targets the poor, much of this is through government provision. And we have government provision, but the quality of that government provision is often very poor. Why? Because the middle class rarely participate in these services. They have seceded. They put their kids in private schools. They go to private doctors. They don't go to the public health service. Basically, there is a fundamental truth here. Services targeted at the poor are often poor services because the poor simply do not have the capability to complain and to fight for their rights. So what we need to do is change this. Have services that are available simultaneously to the middle class and the poor, create virtuous circles that improve quality, draw in the middle class, improve quality further through middle class monitoring. Now, private provision alone will not resolve problems with quality. The private sector, as we know, is also equally prone to quality deficiencies. Certainly, checking quality through monitoring by the government, etc., can help a little bit. But what we really need is to allow the poor to participate along with the middle class. One way is really through cash transfers to the poor. Cash transfers to the poor allow them choice and enable them to join the middle class in using private providers. We also need to improve the quality of public schools and public services where possible and create some competition between the public sector and the private sector so that the people can have more access. Now, there are problems with cash transfers. I don't want to minimize the problems. One of the problems is that some get left out, and this is a complaint that Ritika Kera, for example, from IIT has emphasized. We do need to improve the quality of targeting, ensuring that all who qualify get it. And that means using much better information, collecting that information, using appropriate exclusion criteria, which often are easier to implement than inclusion criteria to target people. We do need to get government experts to play a role in surveying provider experience, checking credentials and capacities, and certifying quality. I'm not saying we need to get the government out of this business. I do think we can do a far better job by giving the poor more choice and forcing the public sector to compete with the private sector in providing these services. And certainly there are state governments, like the government of Delhi, which have improved the quality of education substantially, and we should share the best practices from different states. Now, ultimately, however, the way to get better public services is to enlist ordinary people in improving the quality of local public services. And often this means empowering these citizens by giving them the ability to impose penalties if those providers of services do not provide adequate quality. For example, parent-teacher boards investigate the quality of teaching and have the ability to impose penalties on teachers who don't show up to teach class or who do a relatively poor job. Today, however, local citizenry has little power. Why would a teacher listen to local parents if her salary is paid by the state or central government and locals have little power of reward or punishment? Similarly, they have the local primary health care facility is often closed because locals, again, have no power to actually do something about it. Police are unresponsive. In the United States, the police is paid by the town mayor, not paid by the state capital or by the national capital. That's not to say the United States has the best police in the world. It has its own problems. But it is to say that a way to get a responsive force is to localize control over that rather than to have it controlled centrally. So this leads me to the second point. We need to decentralize policy making and funding following the principle of subsidiarity. I'll come to the principle in just a second. But we must recognize that this requires change. The Constitution placed significant power with the center given the needs of the time. Remember those times. We had to integrate the princely states. Partition had just happened. We were scared that India would disintegrate. And so having a strong center was a way to unite and unify India. Moreover, people like Dr. Ambedkar believed that the central government would be much more modernizing than local government. Remember his famous phrase, "The village is," and I quote, "but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism," end quote. So Ambedkar was very much against local government for these reasons. But, the world has changed, India has changed. The integrity of India is no longer in question, and our population has grown fourfold since independence. Today, the population of Uttar Pradesh, despite having lost part of its territory to new states, is 2/3 the population of the United States. 2/3. And the United States has 50 states. So that's one state of India, 2/3 the size of the United States. Decision making in India is taken at a level that has little knowledge of local population needs. Now, the directive principles of state policy said that we would introduce Panchayati Raj, or a third level of government, and indeed we did with constitutional amendments in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, many of these reforms haven't progressed beyond a certain stage. Powers have not devolved to the local level. And why would they? Since no government, federal or state, wants to delegate powers. Our central government holds on to its powers, in fact, tries to grab more. The state governments hold on to their powers relative to local governments, and again, try and grab more. According to a 2018 Ministry of Finance report, central and state governments in India spend on average 15 to 20 times more per capita than local governments. And this is very different from even China, where, according to Devesh Kapoor, 66% of government employment in China is at the sub-provincial level. Comparatively, in India, only 12% is. So much of the state is outside the local government, including in its funding, including in its powers. And therefore, it's no surprise that there is no local control over the services that are provided, and therefore the services are often subpar. And when people feel disempowered, if they have no say over local issues, they secede from the public system in a variety of ways. They go to private provision, that is a benign way. They go to naxalism, that is a non-benign way which affects our country. More local powers, more local funding, and more local data would allow local officials to be held responsible for local performance, as they are in China, a country we like to emulate. In China, decisions are made by a local official who is sensitive to local conditions and is paid according to local progress, promoted according to local progress. We could learn from some of that. And through decentralization, it would also allow for far more experimentation in governance. We could generate ideas and best practices from all over India and be able to learn from them. Much as we want to learn from how the Delhi government has improved its schools, we could learn all over India. The bottom line I'm trying to say here in this second point is India is too big to be governed entirely from the center or even from state capitals. Functions, funding, and functionaries must be devolved to local bodies. And in doing this, we must follow the principle of subsidiarity. And that, what do I mean by that? It's a Roman Catholic term. It basically means no decision should be taken at a higher centralized level than absolutely necessary for its efficient execution. In other words, you don't decide emission policy at the local level. You need emission policy, what level of emissions cars should have to be decided at the national level. But you can decide who controls the local school at the local level. That's what is meant by subsidiarity. There's no reason for the local school to be controlled by the state government or the national government. Now, of course, immediately people say, well, yeah, but you're trading one problem for another, which is the capture by local elites, which Ambedkar was worried about, the corruption of the local government. Now, in a sense, this is a fear across the world. It's not just an Indian fear. And it is sometimes overblown. In the same way as local decision-making could be captured by local elites, state decision-making could be captured by state elites, and national decision-making by national elites. However, there is also a better democratic antidote at the local level. Use the citizen, the ordinary citizen, to monitor from below, even while you monitor lightly from above using technology. So what do I mean by this? Fund flows today can be monitored fairly effectively through technology. What do people spend their money on at the local government? Who are they spending it on? What are the invoices generated? Is there leakage? That can be done through light monitoring through technology, but also you can disseminate data. And that data can be used by the locals to monitor what's going on. One example is Uganda. Uganda, they were sending money to the schools, and they were being spent by school officials on their own private needs, buying cars and vehicles for themselves. Until they started publishing how much money went to the local school on a board outside the school. This is the money that went. And then the locals could ask, where did that money go? What did the official spend it on? And you can see that that would have an immediate effect in terms of change. However, this is not enough because, the local elite can in fact suppress criticism locally. If you're protesting and you're asking where did the money go, they can beat you up. So what we also need is to strengthen individual rights, especially the right to seek redress through courts against corrupt or repressive officialdom. Now, in the past, our Constitution and our courts have been ambivalent about how much to favor the government against the individual, how much to favor group rights against individual rights. It is time we became much less ambiguous and trusted ordinary people more. Empower the citizenry to check oppressive local, state, or national governments by using the judiciary. And this implies, of course, judicial reform to unclog the backlog of cases in court, to make it easier for people to actually get justice in finite time. But it also means that we need to change laws, like the UAPA law, which is often misused by local officials to quell critics without giving them their day in court. These are the kinds of colonial laws we should get rid of because they do not serve our democracy. Again, many governments have used them, but it is in many ways a law whose time has come, especially if we're going to move to a new India. A focus on individual rights will help most where the individual is most disadvantaged. Minorities like women, the poor, Dalits, tribals, and Muslims will benefit from better access to public goods, bolstered by a strengthening of their fundamental rights. And it's no coincidence that the South, including the state of Tamil Nadu where I'm speaking today, empowered the disadvantaged and has done much better on health and education parameters than much of India where this did not happen. Growth that doesn't take everyone along ultimately is economically wasteful and politically unsustainable. Any country that doesn't get all its people to contribute is wasting resources. How many potential Dr. Janaki Ammal, one of India's finest botanists, Dr. Ambedkar, who I just spoke about, or Dr. Abdul Kalam, are we ignoring by not giving adequate opportunities to minorities? And also remember that in today's hyper-informed world, no minority is likely to settle for second-class status. Any attempt to keep a large part of our population down is not just morally wrong, it will bog us down in perpetual divisiveness and conflict. Furthermore, it will make us pariahs in the world, and we need all the goodwill in the world to grow. The bottom line is we need to do more for everyone. Let me end with, what do we want of the government? And I would argue our government has to look forward on this path and create an enabling framework for the industries of the future. These industries are based on creativity, are based on debate, ideas, data, privacy protection, competition, and contractual protection. These are all important for many of the industries we're talking about. But let me focus on one, which is data. Data does need to be protected with individual control over who gets to see their data. Why is this important? Because it protects the individual against corporate misuse, but it also protects against unconstrained government access. And what this can do then is not only give our citizens confidence to share data, but it can give foreign citizens confidence to share their data with us, knowing that it will not be misused in a way that puts them at a disadvantage. And this is something that China cannot do, because its government can go through any judicial protection to look at whatever data it wants. Who would trust having their medical data held in China today? I can't think of a Western country agreeing to that. But if we create those protections in India, not just against our corporation, but against even our own government, that will help us sell services across the world. Once again, I think protections are useful in order to follow this economic path. Our democracy, our checks and balances on government, our constitutionalism here gives us an advantage in this kind of service over countries like China. But it's more than just data protection. We need a lot of enabling legislation. For example, blockchains. They're not recognized in our laws. We need laws now that recognize blockchains. And blockchains are not just the basis for cryptocurrency, they're the basis for a lot else. And so that kind of enabling legislation we need to create. The government has to be about creating frameworks for these new industries with a light touch, focusing on enabling rather than disabling. Don't ban, but figure out how you can get the best use from these technologies. It also means negotiating international agreements in areas that have not been on our traditional agenda. For example, when we go into negotiations, we're always talking about tariffs when we're talking about international trade. But international trade is not just about tariffs anymore. For example, shouldn't we be negotiating, if we want to expand telemedicine, to be able to get payments from Medicare and Medicaid made directly to the Indian provider because they're providing a service at low cost. Today, that's not possible. But that should be something that we negotiate for, instead of just talking forever about tariffs on food and other stuff. Indian states don't need to wait for the center to establish their frameworks for the post-industrial society. States like Tamil Nadu can start planning now on how they want to move on it. Create committees to look into what these new industries need, what kind of legislation, what kind of support do they need, and put that in place, given that this is a hub for education, this is a hub for technology, this is a hub for some of these high-tech services. Let's work on it and create the frameworks that will help us succeed. So let me conclude. I believe that despite our slow growth in recent years, our increasingly divisive politics and the blows inflicted by the pandemic, India's brightest days are still ahead. However, rather than waiting for grand moves by the center, we need to enable every part of India to grow in its own way. And that means frameworks that support the building of people's capabilities and that allow them to use their initiative. To that end, and to rediscover our soul and shine a beacon for the rest of the world to follow, we have to rejuvenate our democracy. Again, it's not the source of our weakness. If we strategize right and position India for the post-industrial world, it will be a source of strength. We have to work to do, no doubt. Our democracy has to be made to work for everyone. However, if we can do that, we can embark on a new Indian way to grow. That, in my view, rather than any attempt to mimic the Chinese authoritarian manufacturing-led path, will be the source of our salvation. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Let me quickly introduce the moderator for this evening, Mr. Jude Sanneth, please. He is the editor in charge of South India on behalf of CNBC TV 18. You would have seen him in several, he covers several industry sectors. He covers the technology sector as well. So over to you, Jude.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rajan, on behalf of the CIC, I thank you so very much for gracing us with your presence this evening. It was quite an informative lecture, and I'm sure members of the audience have plenty of questions to ask you. So just a word to our audiences before we go ahead. I'll throw the floor open for questions. Just a couple of pointers in the interest of getting by with the Q&A session. It'll be great if you could frame your question in the form of a question, therefore ending with a question mark. If it isn't asking for too much, one question per audience member, so we can get as many people to ask questions as possible. That'll be great in the interest of going forward. Also, a note to those who are watching the session online, it'll be great if you could ask your questions in the form of YouTube comments, I'm told. So I'll quickly run through them as well, and we can get Dr. Rajan to take those questions one by one. But before we get ahead, I think I'll probably have to ask you the first question that's probably on everyone's mind, Dr. Rajan. Given all that's been happening in the Indian economy, and given various projections in terms of growth itself, is the Indian growth outlook scarred? Are we poised to settle for a less than ideal growth number that we would have envisaged some time back?
It's hard to say. We don't have enough data. I would say that I am worried about consumption numbers. They often, in the past, have been strong and the leading sort of source of demand, and they've been relatively weak. So, survey data seem to suggest that our households, especially lower middle class ones, are worried. And one number has me extremely worried when you look at agricultural employment as a share of total employment going up from 36% to 39%. All our employment numbers are in some ways guesses. But agricultural employment doesn't go up in a growing country. It comes down because people are moving from services, from agriculture to services and manufacturing. The fact that it's gone up tells me that we're not sort of, our unemployment numbers should actually be bigger because people have sort of gone back to their villages and, Now, there are positives. Narega rolls have come down a little in November, but all in all, I think there might well be some scarring. And unfortunately, people who just look at the stock market don't seem to recognize that, India maybe has more work to do. I certainly think getting kids back to school is priority one, and it's something that will benefit us if we can do it well.
Yes, well, schools have, some classes at least have been announced that they would reopen. Let's hope, God forbid, a third wave or so does not quite interrupt those plans. All right, can I get my first question from, yes, Mr. N. Ram. Yes, first over to you, sir.
Majoritarianism, which is closely aligned with authoritarianism or authoritarian tendencies, seems to be at play in many parts of India, but the highest court in the land often seems to fail us when it comes to checking it. Isn't that so? Question mark.
Well, you're putting me on the spot here. We certainly have to worry about majoritarianism. I think it is against what our founding fathers sort of believed and wished for. It is against the spirit of the Constitution, and it is economic suicide, as well as potentially national suicide in terms of being a divisive agenda. So I would say that's a path we don't want to go on. I don't want to opine on the Supreme Court and its views. I don't think I'm expert enough to judge, but I certainly think that's a path we cannot afford to go on, especially, and if we look forward to the India of the future, and I think many who espouse majoritarianism also are very strong about national growth. You cannot have the kind of national growth we want in the areas that we want with a very divided agenda. And so even if it's self-interest that we're looking at, it is not something we should embark on.
Stay away from majoritarianism. The gentleman there, I believe, has a question.
Yeah, thank you for your positive message of hope, but you're pinning a lot on democracy, and democracy is more than just elections. We've done a fantastic job. We have a chief election commissioner in the audience in holding free and fair elections, but the other institutions, a free press, legislative bodies that are truly deliberative and informed public, we're weak on all of those, and it suits the people in power who need to make those changes. So how do we break out of this cycle, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a process, right? And that's why I didn't overemphasize the role of the government in all this. As you said, government is often self-interested. But it is also the role of civil society, including political parties, the opposition, etc., to press for change. How does change come about? It comes from a change in beliefs, a change in what the masses of people want. And I think it starts with discussions like this, which say, it is not a dispensable thing. It is not something we can do away with. Democracy is not something we don't need. It is actually fundamental and critical. And that's why we need to strengthen it, whether it's through civil society, whether it's through public arguments, debates. All of those have to come into play. I can't tell you a magic mantra and say, so-and-so is going to change everything. It's not going to be one person. It's going to be a movement.
Yes, but of course, the institutions being strong are, very critical role to the furtherance of democracy. Yes, sir. I believe you have a question.
My question is on democratic deliberation and reform. In an earlier period, many reforms are done by stealth. In the more recent period, they're being rammed down the system. In the context of the farm laws passage and the repeal, what lessons or implications would you say arise for the reform process?
Yeah, I think there is a good lesson to learn, which is, yes, in the past, it used to be reformed by stealth. By the time people wake up, it's already done. And, they'll take some time to wake up. But increasingly, in this connected world where information is readily available, it's hard to do things by stealth. And if you can't do it by stealth, then you have to do it the hard way, which is by negotiation. And that is better because stealth sometimes, as we see with the farm laws, not so much stealth but ramming down, has a one-size-fits-all aspect. Because you haven't involved the states, you haven't consulted as widely as you should. Of course, you can say we've consulted for the last 30 years, we know what to do. But the specific people in that room may not know what has been deliberated on, may not know the nuances of what has changed in different states, may not know the nuances of different crops. And therefore, I think having wider consultation, working government better, is probably what we need now, taking into account the lessons of the farm laws, rather than either doing it by stealth or doing it by force.
But when the government tried bulldozing, so to speak, those farm laws in parliament, we saw Kisans across the country take on month-long protests, which of course, ended just a few days ago when they announced that they would, go back home, especially after the government made those promises. But the question remains, how does the government now resolve the farm MSP issue? That has opened a whole new debate. What are your views on that?
I don't think there's, again, a pat solution. But I think there is a fundamental problem that needs to be resolved, which is that we procure basically 2 crops in a handful of states. And therefore, the farmer is going to produce those crops. And as you know, producing rice is a problem given we are a water-starved country. So we need to move the farmer away from those crops. And the farmer will be the first one to say, yes, I want to move away from these crops. But what choice do you afford me when this is the only thing that you procure? This is the only thing I feel safe producing. So what we need to do is ensure there is procurement at reasonable prices for other crops, moving the farmer away from producing tons and tons of rice and wheat, which are perhaps costly to export, but costly to store also.
Right.
And that means whatever solution we have should ensure that the farmer understands he will get paid for that. Now, you don't need to procure it. I mean, for example, Yogendra Yadav suggests, why don't you make a differential payment? We have to figure out how to make the differential payment without leakage. So when the farmer produces his crop, you can take a satellite photo, this is the crop he's produced, so many tons of bajra. And based on acreage, based on this thing, you give him a check directly. We know how to send checks to farmers today. Give him a check based on that acreage, which is the difference between the local price of that crop and the MSP. And then he figures out who he wants to sell it to.
Absolutely.
But we have technological solutions. If we can make them work, I think the state of Haryana is doing this right now with bajra. But we can figure out how to do it more widely based on the local capabilities. But this means that in some states, maybe there's no need because the private markets work reasonably well. In some states, there may be a need. This means a framework at the center, but decentralizing the details to the states.
So modern technology for fiscal assurance, I think that's the need of the hour. Did somebody else have a question? Yes, ma'am. Can we get the mic here, please?
So school children have lost almost 2 years. I heard in your interview day before yesterday with Rajdeep Sardesai, you were telling that they need some remedial measures. Can you elaborate on that practically? Because somebody can't jump from class 7 to class 9, no? Yeah. Can you please elaborate?
Well, I would say it's not just jumping from class 7 to class 9. They've also forgotten what they knew in class 7. Having been out of school for I think Pratham showed that some of them have actually lost ground relative to where they were. So, I mean, I think they have to be brought back into the school first gently. And when I say remedial, the ones that have had a very poor experience outside school, they haven't had much ability to get online learning during these 2 years, will need more support. And that means special classes to bring them back up to speed. And so,
instead of academics, can they be put into skilled things?
Into?
Skilled things.
Skilled. Oh, you're talking about vocational.
Because in the villages and everywhere.
Yeah. I mean,
because they have lost everything.
Yeah.
Their brain is, so to say, blank. So,
I mean, so
instead of academics,
right.
ranting academics, can they be exposed to skilled things?
Now, I'm not an education expert, so I'm not. You are probably more expert at this than I am. However, I will say, I mean, there has been talk about vocational training, et cetera, but usually what this also means is typically the poor are sidelined into vocational while, the rich get into everything else. We have to make sure that it doesn't unnaturally disadvantage students. It becomes a choice rather than a disadvantage. And I think there is a special responsibility of state and national government at this point to work on bringing that child, especially the poorer children, back to the mainstream. Otherwise, I mean, not just vocational, a lot of these children will drop out. We will lose a lot of children that who could otherwise have better. To my mind, this is the single biggest problem facing the country. And when I read the newspapers, I'm struck by how little talk there is of this particular problem.
I believe Dr. Raguramrajan has a question, but we'll finish off with.
Let me go back to economics. The most important thing for us today is really to accelerate economic growth. I personally believe employment and all that follows from a faster rate of economic growth. But in talking about the models of growth, there is not one unique model that we need to follow. Maybe a certain kind of export-led growth also can be happening, certain other things. But one point that I wanted to ask you is really that while you talk about the export of services, the technology element comes into great prominence. And therefore, what we are really seeing today is, or what we may see today in the coming days is, the divergence between the skill development that we have now and the kind of technology that is required in order to be able to compete effectively in the world. Now, this may be, it may take, it's going to be difficult to reconcile it immediately. And therefore, what do we do? Because the people are talking about, as you know, in Western countries, moving from 2-day weekend to 3-day weekend, so that the technology doesn't require all the people. Now, we have such a huge population. And how do you recognize the role of the new technology? Yeah. And how to reconcile it with our need to increase employment? The output may increase, but whether employment will increase is a question mark.
Right. It's a great question, and I think this is a question that has constantly sort of worried people, right, over the centuries, not just over the decades, but particularly at times like this, whether technology will displace work, and therefore whether there'll be enough jobs. Now, sir, I would say the following, that in the United States, today unemployment is 4.2%. So there are jobs. There are plenty of jobs. Despite today, in many areas, because they're not finding workers, they're thinking of automating the dirty jobs, the jobs where they can't attract workers anymore, typically low-skilled jobs. So I would say that it is quite possible to have adequate employment even with technological progress. The question is, how do you adjust your work processes, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, take for example, are we providing enough services in the United States? I'm talking about an advanced country because that's where technology you would think is even more problematic. Today, if I ask for a medical appointment, it takes me 3 months to get a medical appointment. That's suggesting there's not enough medical services in the United States, right? And if technology could help spread medical services more widely, telemedicine, for example, then that would be helpful. So I think there are fears about technology, but typically we've seen that technology coupled with human beings is often better than technology alone or the human being alone. You know, our accountants used to do massive sort of tabulations on every page. Today, Excel does it for them. So they now do something else. They focus more on the ideas behind balance sheets rather than adding up the columns. I think the human develops and moves. And just one point to say that I have faith that this will happen by saying that, you know, we talk in a number of countries about a universal basic income as necessary because people will not have jobs. Do you know when we first started about talking about universal basic income in the United States? It was in the 1960s. There's a fear that computers would displace everybody. In the Johnson administration, they started talking about universal basic income. This is a perennial fear, but I think, you know, it has yet to come about because human beings change their work. We're not adding up as we used to. Excel does it. You know, your software program does it. But we're doing better things.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Raguramrajan had a question about technology, and the next question I have for you is pretty much in the same breath. You spoke about India having to become the front office for the world, and that is such a crucial part of our growth trigger itself. But you know, there is a very real potential of India becoming the digitization back office of the world. Now, could that be a potential growth trigger for us, Dr. Rajan?
I think everything. I think Dr. Raguramrajan said it well. We should try all sort of pathways. What I want to say is it will help if we have a vision of at least the main pathway, because that will allow government to then produce what needs to be, to do what needs to be done to make that possible. If we want a presence in blockchain technology, we need laws that allow that, that facilitate that. If we want, for example, you know, want to focus on human capital skills, we need to focus on our education, invest more in soft infrastructure than hard infrastructure. These affect the choices. You can't do everything. You have to know when you have limited sort of resources, where to put those resources to work. So what I'm arguing is if we have this vision, some of it requires doing what you would normally do. Improving human capital is clear for every sort of pathway we want. But some of it does involve choices, and we can make better choices.
Make better choices. I believe we have a question from this side. Yes. And we'll pass the mic to the gentleman on this side after this question is done. Yes.
Sir, my question is about agriculture. Agriculture, you say that more people are now deployed. In reality, in Tamil Nadu, we have less people being employed. Tamil Nadu has increased animal husbandry, which is comparatively a value-added item, or secondary agriculture, we can say, from primary. We have moved from 30% to 49% today within 15 years, thanks to animal husbandry as well as poultry. Now, we are facing a shortage of people, not actually having more people coming in. And our wages have gone up, and getting the people is a real challenge. You are talking about general scenario of India. Is it mainly pertaining to North India like Uttar Pradesh and other places where they are focusing on primary crops, or value added also?
No, I was just citing an all India number for employment in agriculture. But you're absolutely right that, that there's a lot of migrant labor coming into the south from Uttar Pradesh, from Bihar, etc. And there is a lot of, I mean, this is natural. We would expect it if we have different parts of India growing at different rates. And I think this is to be welcomed rather than to, at the same time, we have to recognize that we need to create adequate safety nets for our migrant labor, as we saw with the onset of the pandemic, that there was a huge amount of distress caused to people who had to go back to their villages, especially from the cities. So that's something to think about.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Dr. Rajan, in the context of constitutionalism, of which federalism is a very important component, do you think that the GST has been a success or a failure or something in between?
Curveball questions being thrown at you.
Yeah, look, I think it hasn't been as successful as one might have liked and one envisaged. But I think over time we are dealing with some of the glitches and it's getting to be better. At some point we have to ask, is it all that we wanted or do we need to do more? I think you started the question with the word federalism. We have to ask whether federalism is adequately respected in the processes we have in place for GST governance and management. But I think this is work in progress. And obviously, hopefully, over time, it becomes more effective.
Before I come to the gentleman at the back, I've got a question from the audience as well. You spoke about federalism just now, and you also spoke at length about devolution of powers while you were delivering your lecture. So the question reads, why do we have only one RBI for a large, diverse country like India? The US has 12 reserve banks that collectively decide the policy of the Fed Reserve. Do you feel a Reserve Bank of Madras or a Reserve Bank of Calcutta or a Reserve Bank of Delhi is a good beginning?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, the reality is the regional feds in the United States don't do anything on monetary policy. They really are all about local supervision and local currency. And in fact, the RBI has regional offices which do precisely that. So there's an RBI office in Chennai, which is nearby. Some of these offices have currency chests in them about distributing currency, but they also do local regional supervision, etc. So we have a structure somewhat like that, but yes, monetary policy decisions are taken by the central office of the RBI, and that's where the principle of subsidiarity comes in. You can't have different policies within the country when you have one money, one rupee. You can't have every state having a different interest rate being decided by the local RBI, because that will just, arbitrage will make sure that it cannot be different. So that's a situation where a central policy is not an entirely bad thing.
The gentleman in navy blue, before we move on to this side.
Good evening, sir. Sir, regarding the localizing the policies and decision making, does it mean like a creation of more smaller states and UTs?
I don't think it necessarily means that. It means empowering existing bodies more. So municipal bodies, for example, giving them more powers and more funding. Maybe we need to think about property taxes, but also ways to equalize property taxes if rich areas have more funding than poor areas. But we need to think about ways that we can actually sort of empower local bodies, and I think that will be beneficial. By empowering, I mean the obvious decisions, what to build, where to build, and but also some issues like what to manage. Should local schools come within the purview of the local body, and what rights do they have in determining pay scales and working conditions, as well as hiring or punishing non-performers.
Right, I believe we have a question from the lady this side. Yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan, for that insightful talk. In the background of climate change and in the background that farm laws have just been repealed, how do you push for policies that respect the environment and some which may sometimes be locally unpopular, such as a price for water or a price for managing solid waste?
I mean, you said locally unpopular at the end, and I don't know. Sometimes people, when assured that they will get the water regularly in reasonable quantities, are willing to pay for it, because the alternative, which is queuing up for, in front of trucks and paying the trucker a large sum of money, is less pleasant, is harder. So sometimes when people are given the choice, pay for regular supply or be dependent on irregular supply and the constant need to go to private sources to get that supply, may prefer to pay. Now, I think the broader point you made about the environment is an important one. Environment decisions often have to be taken at the state or national level because they imply regulation, they imply a certain amount of constraints on what can be done, a certain amount of zoning, no-go places where you can't build and so on to protect the fauna and flora. At the same time, I think we have seen, for example, in France, the consequences when national level environmental decisions don't respect local sensibilities. The whole Gilets jaunes movement was people protesting gasoline taxes, saying, you guys don't drive. You're sitting in Paris, and therefore you feel it's okay to impose large taxes. We are the guys who drive 50 kilometers a day, and therefore we pay the taxes. It comes off our back, and there was a huge protest movement. So I think we do need to make some decisions at the higher levels, but we need to also engage people in figuring out how to make the most effective decisions, the least disruptive in their lives, so that they don't feel this is imposed by an elite which cares about the air quality in Delhi, but not about their livelihoods. And that sort of requires wider consultation. Again, the broader point about taking other views into account.
Dr. Rajan, one question from my side before we wrap up with questions from the audience. Do you see the world heading for a financial problem, given the rally in equities and also cryptos that's been happening for quite a while now? And where does India figure as part of this interesting place and time that we find ourselves in?
Well, one number that I simply cannot understand with the level of growth we have is the real interest rate in the United States. The 10-year real interest rate is negative 1%. With the kind of growth the US has, way above potential right now, with the kind of inflation it has, it's just hard to reconcile that number. And low real interest rates over long periods are responsible for holding up asset prices, right? Many tech companies, startups making huge losses are being priced on a distant future where they will make a ton of money. You bring that forward at very low interest rates, it looks like nirvana. That's why you're paying many, many billions for a loss-making company. It strikes me that if those interest rates go back to where they should be, given growth, given what the Fed has to do, then there will be some asset price correction. And of course, in euphoric times when everything sort of has high values, long-dated zero-coupon bonds, which is effectively what cryptos are or some of these tech companies, will adjust.
Right.
So how much, when, who knows? If I knew that, I'd be a rich person.
It's part of the great unknown. I believe we can take 2 more questions from the audience. Let me go to the gentleman over there, and we'll get the final word or the final question from Mr. Enram.
Good evening, Dr. Rajan. So on the topic of cryptos, the Indian government with its crypto regulation bill just spoke about a framework for creating a central bank digital currency. Now, CBDCs come with extensive design challenges and risks associated with concerns of anonymity and things like that. What is your view on CBDCs and whether there are certain specific use cases or policy aims for which these are well suited?
Again, a great question. I think central bank digital currencies, the first sort of one by a big central bank is the Chinese digital yuan. And of course, they have a lot of concerns that a country should think about. One, for example, is data. Who holds the data? The Chinese say there's 2 layers. But the commercial banking layer is a see-through layer if the central authorities want to see what's happening to individual A or individual B. They call it controllable anonymity. That sounds Orwellian. it does seem that they can choose to see what they want to see. In a democracy like ours, the RBI shouldn't be seeing what everybody does. We should be protected from that level of vigilance. So how do you achieve that? That's certainly one question. There are also serious questions for the private sector. If today I fear a bank is in trouble, I have to go to the bank to withdraw my deposit. And then I have to worry about which bank I put it in. With a central bank digital currency, bank runs are automatic. I just move from my bank into the central bank digital currency. How do we avoid that kind of bank run from the deposit to the digital currency? Well, for that you have to have limits on how much people can hold. But if you have to have limits on how much people can hold, you have to know who holds everything. Now, our courts haven't agreed to the government knowing who holds every single deposit. So, I mean, these are the areas where I think we need to think far more. There's one big concern also about central bank digital currencies. Apart from crowding out private sector effort, what if the central bank digital currency gets hacked? I mean, these are all working on cryptography, right? But if we have quantum computers which can undo various forms of cryptography, can we potentially get a central bank digital currency that is hacked? These are questions I'm not an expert on, but I can ask these questions. And certainly we have to have strong answers. Do we crowd out the private sector? Do we create the possibility of more risk in the private sector? What happens to the data? What happens to innovation? Do we crowd out innovation in payments? In the US, the Fed is worried about all these things. Instead, it's embarking on Fed Now, which is a form of instant payment. We already have Fed Now. It's called UPI. And so we are ahead of the curve as far as fast payments go. And so the question we have to ask is, what does the CBDC add to what is already possible in India? And over time, there are answers. For example, smart contracts, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to adopt a deliberative approach to doing it.
Before we come to Mr. Ram, let me squeeze one last question in. The gentleman in yellow.
Yeah.
I think he already has a mic, sir. You can hold on to your mic.
Hi, good evening. And the Global Inequality Report just came recently, and it showed top 1% in India holding 22% of the national wealth. And the debate is back again, inequality versus poverty eradication. As you see the future where India tries to grow the way you're talking about, where do you think we should focus on between these two?
So, I am a firm believer that we should expand the pie as far as possible. Level up rather than level down. That said, where inequality comes from privileged access to government contracts, to protection, to lack of competition, I think those are areas where we should do better. Should we make it unprofitable, unappealing to be rich in India? I think not. I think that offers an incentive to everyone. Instead, we should try and make it possible for everybody to get that way. But get that way by being better, by being a more competent entrepreneur, by providing goods and services people want, rather than knowing the right people or having the right influence. And that, to my mind, offers us an agenda on what we need to work on. I would desist from imposing punitive taxes, but I would improve the Competition Commission, and I would increase transparency, the free press, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things, to my mind, that will help us create a more just society.
The last question of the evening, Mr. Ram.
Thank you. Is there hard evidence in the academic literature that corruption, which is virtually omnipresent in India, harms the economy and harms economic development? I know this is a large question and may want to may ask for another session, but your impression, your mind on this.
The question is compared to what, right? That's really the right question. compared to a government that functions, clearly, corruption is a tax in many ways. Lower quality goods being produced, more holdups for normal, government services. It's a problem. Compared to, a government that doesn't work, speed money, does it make things work a little faster? There are some in the economic literature who've argued that. Is it better to have no speed money and a government that is responsive? I think almost surely yes. So it really depends on the situation. And then the worst of all is corruption with no outcome, right? Where the speed money is paid but nothing actually happens and you still don't get your permit. Or somebody else comes and asks for yet another bribe. And there are lots of studies on all of this. But I think the bottom line is, yes, if we can get rid of it, better. And that would be good for our society.
One shouldn't get the impression that there is the license for corruption at this point in time. Thank you very much. For the last 1.5 hours, he has spoken without even a sip of water. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jude. Thank you, audience. We didn't expect this many people. We didn't want so many people. We restricted the number of people here. But then we couldn't control the number of people who walked in, and we couldn't stop them because we kept the upper gallery completely empty. Thank you, everyone. And for those of you who haven't met Dr. Chandramouli, IAS, he's our new director who's joined the board of Chennai International Center. He's playing a leading role as the managing director of CIC. We all welcome Chandramouli, and thank you very much for spending the evening with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan.